Hi, my name is Cristian Marroquin, and I'm currently attending Miracosta College. For my history research project, I wanted to take into consideration the calls for political reform and the pandemic currently affecting us in one way or another, and how we should approach the situation and the rise of movements such as Black Lives Matter as we attempt to go back to a state of being normal. Today, I will be presenting Reconstruction Reversal, how Reconstruction Era policies can keep America great. The year 2020 has been a turbulent and unexpected year for everyone as the nation battles the coronavirus alongside the rest of the world. As both global and domestic leaders scramble to find an earnest solution to the pandemic while easing the economic havoc that it has caused, the current reforms being discussed for the country and economy have been bombarded by political protesters who have used the spotlight to address institutional racism and police brutality against Black Americans. Although these movements have gained international speculation, they are not recent creations and have been fighting for justice for years, such as when protesters took to the streets in 2014 when Eric Garner was choked to death to, to avoid such similar situations from occurring again, such as in March and May of this year when Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were also killed by police officers. Adjacent to the murders of Black Americans, they face attempts of voter disenfranchisement in southern states as right wing politicians attempt to re elect the sitting president, Donald Trump. What issues plague the African American community relative to the Civil War? To understand this question, we need to not only see the outcomes of the Civil War, but we need to see um, how African Americans live prior to, during, and after the Civil War. Black people have been facing a harsh and cruel reality that has stemmed from the birth of the country and from slavery that was used to drive the nation forward. Originally, when the first settlers came to America, slavery was not thought of in the way it is today. Prior to slavery in America, it mostly targeted low class individuals and prisoners who ultimately had some legal protections and rights, such as marriage, or maybe even a path to freedom, such as in ancient Rome. Even when America started, its workforces consisted of white indentured servants who worked contracts guaranteeing them freedom and capital after set amount of years, but this form was quickly phased out by African slaves who had no rights in comparison to their predecessors and thus were cheaper to care for. They were treated as properly and had no legal claims for rights or even complaints against their masters. Although some of them were manumissioned by their masters or through service in the military, they still did not gain any political advantage as they were not allowed to vote and still faced the discrimination in society, and in some cases were re enslaved if they were thought to be an escaped slave. This also occurred in the North because of the federal laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Acts, that superseded local policies and allowed slave patrols to legally police freedmen and hunt escaped slaves down. As the nation struggled with differences between economic and social policies regarding slaves in America, the North triumphed in their fight to liberate the slaves in what was the Civil War. As free African Americans and society were redefining their freedom, Southern legislators were quick to pass laws that went around the Emancipation Proclamation and both the 13th and the 14th Amendment as they tried to establish what they deemed normal prior to the Civil War by putting up the similar economic and social infrastructures under new names. These laws were vague individually but came to reach the same conclusions that were meant to be avoided in the first place. As freedmen were attempting to rebuild their lives, they came under attack by what we now know as the Black Codes. These Black Codes excluded race but were clearly meant to be enforced on the newly freed slaves to reestablish the former power dynamic that treated them as property. Vagrancy and loitering was criminalized in order to keep African Americans suffering continued through some means of labor, whether by requiring not only to be employed, but to also carry a proof of employment, or else they would risk incarceration, where they would be made to work in prison, or would have a labor contract set up that forced them to work for a former slave owner and northern capitalists. This contributed to the stereotype that Black Americans were lazy if they were freed. Another claim made by the Union was that those that did not oppose the Union would be able to hold office in the aftermath of the Civil War. But after the death of Abraham Lincoln, shortly after the end of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson allowed former Confederate officials to return to office. Meanwhile, they searched for new representatives to take office. An example of this would be Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of what would have been the Confederate States of America, and who held office as a Georgia governor despite the obvious conflicts of interest. The new convict leasing system was following the war was not only helped rebuild the indebted South through cheap labor, but was used to target freedmen because of the racial animosity that was failed to be addressed by the Reconstruction. The Black Codes were meant to police African Americans in society when around white people and to keep them in line. Even in constant caution, the laws were made in such a way that it targeted Black people for tedious activities, as the goal was to be able to imprison them and give them harsher sentences along with it. Once the freedmen were legally but unjustly imprisoned, they went back to a world of slavery that was renamed as convict leasing. As convicts, African Americans faced violence and abuse as they were leased out to private contractors by the state. Despite being freedmen outside of their judicial predicament and actually having a general idea of when they were to be released, they were seen as cheap and disposable labor that resulted in many deaths and were just maintained a life enough to work and but not enough to burn it back into the profits they generated. Because of alleged clerical errors, convicts were further imprisoned indefinitely as their paperwork was not in order and did not provide them an actual release date. A good attempt of reconstructing the South was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established in 1865 by Congress to help the 4 million newly freed slaves adjust to society while also helping those impoverished by the Civil War. In its few short years, the agency helped to reconnect families displaced prior to and in result of the war. They provided necessities like food, clothing, and shelter while also teaching many freedmen to read and write. They also provided access to marriage, legal aid, land, and work contracts when available as they reached many ceilings in their endeavors. The end of the agency did not come due to a lack of failure of itself necessarily. It was rather due to a lack of funding and support of Southern white Americans who felt they were being cheated and stolen from by the people they had actually cheated and stolen from. In response to their oppression, African Americans were limited in their protest to the surroundings, since in slavery they risked death for disobedience, while as freemen they risked incarceration for being Black and ultimately die slaving away in a prison yard or in a chain gang as they try to survive their sentences. It is apparent that in those times, social movements for the advancement of African Americans were limited to violent means. Despite being enslaved, there were numerous slave uprising attempts in our history as African Americans risked everything in the name of justice. An infamous slave uprising was the 1831 Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia. Nat Turner was a slave who was seen as a bright individual and garnered such an influence that he assembled a group of 77 slaves to stand up to the community that controlled them and ended up massacring the surrounding area. After the horrific scene occurred, most people fled but were recaptured in the end and sentenced to death. The outcome of the rebellion was not so well thought out since they were recaptured, and it also went along to affect those in the surrounding area as they were thought to be in on the conspiracy and enabled harsher laws against slavery. The failure nonetheless lamented the misery of the slaves involved and their willingness to pursue freedom even when they are seen on the wrong side of the law. Nowadays, most people couldn't imagine having their rights infringed and would argue that voting for better solutions and candidates would be a great opportunity to get rid of those situations, but this was not always an option, for Black Americans at least. Despite gaining rights to vote, such as in 1870 when the 15th Amendment was ratified and gave Black men the right to vote, Black men still faced voter intimidation tactics that were meant to keep them away and voting for better situations. Black Americans were asked to provide poll taxes that accumulated if unpaid and inherently kept someone from voting for life. They were asked to perform literacy tests to determine whether they could vote, despite blatant laws that banned slaves from learning to read and write a few years prior. Another form of voter suppression that was used during the time of Reconstruction was the use of the grandfather clause that allowed people to vote and bypass all of the previous restrictions mentioned based on the valid voter status of their ancestors before 1895. These laws stand alone as a conservative but fair group of laws, but when taken into context, it is clear that separate but equal approaches were shams used to further the racial animosity in the nation. What steps can be taken to provide a true sense of equality in America for a successful Reconstruction? As we continue forward as a nation, we mustn't forget our history so as to not repeat it. It might not seem like oppression is impossible in the capacity it once was, but that doesn't mean it doesn't occur. The repercussions of Reconstruction still ring loud and clear, and you can choose to look for it, but as in the past, it is easy to turn a blind eye. Despite all the rules in place, now doesn't mean that Black Americans still aren't facing a harsh reality in comparison to most Americans. Black Americans make up 13% of the overall population in the US, yet make up 40% of the prison population. Of those serving life sentences, that number jumps up to 48% of the prison population. Even Black Americans on probation make up 38% of the system. Outside of the prison, they are still more likely to come in contact with police as opposed to white Americans. This is not too far from the days of convict leasing, especially when you take into consideration the private prisons who profit from full prisons and the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the process. Another way to overcome this situation is to support the movements out today. And a lot of the criticisms they face can also be can be seen as in earlier years where they were not allowed to peacefully protest, which in modern day America has been used to silence movements such as Black Lives Matter due to the pandemic and prioritizing the pandemic in certain situations, such as disenfranchising Black voters, but not when it comes to eating out at restaurants. It might seem easy to tear apart statements like defund the police, which are quite controversial, but when you look at the bigger picture and you realize what they actually stand for, those snappy slogans are used as clickbait to show people what's really happening in America and how we should actually fix the situation, such as when it comes to police brutality or the mass incarceration of Black Americans. Another way to support it, Black solidarity, is to donate to groups that actually focus on this, and instead of just ignoring them or thinking that someone else will support it, actively supporting is what's going to make a change. Not being racist isn't enough. You have to be anti-racist, especially where in modern day America, people are still facing voter suppression, such as in Georgia, where the Wayne County is being scrutinized and attempted to have the votes there thrown out on the basis of mismatched signatures. This isn't too far from not necessarily literacy tests, but maybe poll taxes and other methods that were used to block people from the polls. Something meaningless and something that isn't being applied to everyone in the country. That is my presentation, and if there's any questions, I will take them now.